You're listening to Online Pet Health Podcasts with Dr. Megan Kelly. Continuing education for veterinarian rehabilitation therapists. Learn more at onlinepethealth.com.
Hey Vet Rehabbers, wow, how awesome was the Vet Rehab Summit on Saturday. If you missed it, don't worry, Online Pet Health members, you've got 30 days still to access it, and you can access it via the Vet Rehab Summit login page. It was so amazing being together online, and for me, it's as close as we can get to feel like we're being together in real life. Thanks to everyone who participated on the day and shared in the excitement with all of us. Now this week I speak to David Levine from the University of Tennessee, and he needs little introduction to the majority of us in the vet rehab world. David has lectured for us many times on the Online Pet Health platform, and this is not his first podcast with us either. Now when David suggested the topic today, I will say that I was somewhat surprised. I have sat on the IAVRPT board with David for the last 4 years, and I did not know he was such a microbiology geek. So when you listen to this interview, you can actually hear the gleam in his eyes as he talks about this topic. So today we are chatting about microbes in our practices, and David gives some solid advice on how to minimize potential outbreaks. So now, if you're not an Online Pet Health paid member, you can always sign up for our free limited access membership. The current webinars in the free membership area is Postoperative Complications by David Dykes, Biomechanics of the Equine Axial Skeleton, and Understanding Tendinopathies, How to Help and How Not to Hurt. And that was lectured by Amy Hesback. 3 brilliant webinars. And just so you know, in our paid membership, in our small animal platform, we have 185 hours now of learning. In our equine membership, 120 hours. And in our hydrotherapy membership, 88 hours. So before we head over to my chat with David, a quick word from our sponsors. Choosing the right therapy, laser, and PMF systems for your practice are big decisions. And that's why Response System has been helping to make that decision easier for over 35 years by offering both Class 3B and Class 4 lasers, as well as a full line of PMF products designed for both small animals and horses. All of their systems are fully rechargeable and adapted to international grids. You can find out more at respondsystems.com. So over to my chat with David. Hey, David, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, good to see you, Meg, as always.
No, I was so interested because you and I were just chatting, and after I saw you at the IAVRPT conference in Cambridge, which was amazing, I said, I need to get you on the podcast again. And we were chatting and we were saying, well, what topic are we going to chat about? And then you came up with, what about this? I have this interest in microbiology. And I was like, wow, yes, I'm so excited about this topic because it's something that comes up often, especially in our Facebook groups. And we don't really have many specialists or people that know how to answer all the questions. So we're going to be firing loads of questions your way today. So let us know how you got into sort of this passion for microbiology. Where did that come from?
Sure. Well, I think like a lot of people, the first time you get live cells and you put them under a microscope, you have to think way back to pre-veterinary days or maybe your coursework as a veterinary nurse or something. We went and we collected water from just some fields. And, you collect some water, maybe from a pond or a farm or just some water sitting in a puddle. And then you bring it back and you put a few drops on a plate, and you put your plate cover on very carefully, and you try to choose your right, magnification, and you start to look at all of these things in this little bit of water that are alive and moving. And it's a really eye-opening experience to realize how we coexist with all of these different billions and billions of living microbes around us. So I think, my passion for it started many, many years ago. I work in a clinical infectious disease control unit in my spare time where we do microbiological surveillance, primarily in hospitals with lab techs and the physicians. And I work primarily in a neonatal intensive care unit for that, but also hematology, oncology, and we'll culture anything. We just have fun, really exposing people to the wonder of microbes and how we use them, from making beer to, how they had parts in plagues, or all kinds of, the history is just fascinating. And of course we have, these evolution of these different microbes that we've had to deal with over time. And so for me, it's been just something that I think is really fun. And I love microscopes too. I have, a fancy USB that goes to a big screen. And I actually like to take funny things like, maybe you find a pine needle, put it under the microscope and look at different angles, and you can take amazing pictures. It's kind of this unseen, unhidden form of art in a way. So, maybe one day that'll be my hobby when I retire. I can just take pictures of things that are very small. But I do work in this field, on a weekly basis. And so I had done a couple of studies on environmental contamination. And we had sampled, in hospitals, different areas, for example, wheelchairs, to look at contaminants on wheelchairs that are pushed around hospitals. Or, we've published studies on things like ultrasound lotion, and found, some where we leave those bottles laying around, what microbes grow in that, and massage lotions on the human side, and all kinds of different things. So it's just something that I kind of do for fun, but, it also has a good impact. And I go to the, our yearly meeting is the Association for Professionals in Infection Control. This year it was in Indianapolis. So we presented a couple of things there, and I write blogs for Infection Control Today. All, on the side, we have to have our little side hobbies. So yeah,
I did not
for me,
know that about you.
it's a fascinating side. And one of the courses I would like to take, because I'm an ultimate, school geek with 6 different degrees, and I'd like to take a course in bioremediation in the next year. Maybe, I tend to take at least one class every semester because it's free at the university. But bioremediation is also fascinating to me, how we use primarily bacterial species to, in things, everything from compost to how we use particular strains of bacteria to clean up oil spills, like the big Horizon oil spill down in the Gulf Coast. A lot of bacterial species were used to help degrade the oil. And so that's, a whole form of science called bioremediation, where we use it. And instead of things like maybe ammonia, there are bacteria that can be used, to clean up blood spills versus just, bleach or things like that. So anyway, I could talk all day about bacteria, but I'll be quiet now.
Nice, I like that. So working together with the bacteria. So one of the things you said now, obviously, is like you take that little drop of water and you look under the microscope, and then you see all these living organisms. And because we can't see them with the naked eye, I feel like sometimes we just forget that they're there, right? So if I go look into our clinics and our rehab clinics, I think there's one obvious place that we're thinking about, and that's in hydrotherapy. So we're thinking about the water and, what bugs are in there. But I must say, past that, I haven't thought about the rest of my clinic, tables, surfaces, mats, maybe that dogs are lying on. And often we'll have some immunocompromised animals, or animals that have just had surgery. They've maybe got wounds that are not completely closed over. Their immune systems might be a bit suppressed. So these are things that we really have to think about, right? So can you let us know, from your experience, have you done any testing and done any swabs in any rehab facilities to see, just on surfaces, if there is anything that you've picked up there that would potentially be of concern that we should think about?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. And of course, the answer is yes. But last year we did 5 different veterinary rehab facilities, and we swabbed everything from the floors to the HVAC systems to laser probes to harnesses that we use on dogs, to land treadmills, to the water, in the underwater treadmills and the belts and the jets and all of our balls and things like that. And so when we test for bacteria, we use, it's a bit of an old school method where we actually swab things. We put it in a transport media and take it back to the lab and actually inoculate. The reason we do that is a lot of the DNA based systems, where you take a swab and you put it in a machine and it matches it. It doesn't tell you if the bacteria is live or dead. So in another way, we might say that is viable or non-viable. Some of those systems do, based on a fluorescence. Some of them just look at DNA. So you can have dead cells, and I'm always interested in knowing what's alive. So we use, it's a more time-consuming method, because then you have to streak things on all of those media that you learned about back in the day, like, your tryptic soy broths and your tryptic soy augurs and your mannitol salt augurs and your McConkeys. And so you have to, streak on all of these different plates and put them in an incubator. And then, we count our CFUs. And if it's water, we have to do our serial dilutions and all of those things that I'm sure most people did at one time and we're very happy to forget. But
That's me.
The viable cell counts are what's really important. And, a lot of the fancy instruments just look at, based on a DNA, was the cell there, but it can't tell if it's live or dead. So short answer is yes, we have swabbed. And, not only in veterinary rehab clinics, but in human rehab clinics, in all kinds of different hospital units and outpatient clinics. For example, a unit that we sampled for about 9 months was a cystic fibrosis unit. And we were looking for different bacteria that we might find in a unit for patients where there's a CF clinic, specifically some of the things like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, some of the bacteria that are going to affect those patients more. So we certainly will target different bacteria, based on the patient population and what we're looking for. And the species. I mean, certain bacteria affect people a lot more than they affect dogs. And, their dogs, seem to be a little bit more hardy in general. And, but there are different bacterial species like Staph pseudointermedius is not a big deal for people, but a big deal for dogs. So, and then that brings us to the whole zoonotic disease and, what some people used to call reverse zoonosis, or now we call, anthroponotic diseases we can give to animals, and zoonotic being diseases animals can give to us. We think of rabies, something like that. And then we have things like MRSA that are both. We can pass MRSA to a dog, and a dog can pass MRSA to us. So yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of, permutations of this stuff. And, I guess in general, our skin is a great barrier. Whether you're a person or a dog, we have a lot of bacteria that are all over. And of course, within us, we have so many gut bacteria, as an example. And it's when we have a break in the skin that we, are a bit more diligent about things. I mean, the stratum corneum and the epidermis and the dermis are great at keeping things out, which is good, because every morning when we take a shower, if it wasn't good at keeping things out, we would fill up with water and blow up. So skin is a wonderful barrier, and it is more in, these entryways, that we have after wounds that we worry a lot more about.
So, obviously just the presence of bacteria is not necessarily concerning, because we've got good bacteria and we've got bad bacteria. So, and how often should we be doing swabs in our clinics? So just, we'll talk about the hydrotherapy area and the water separately to this. Just in general, how often should clinics be checking to see if there's any sort of bacteria that are lurking there? And what is the most common, bacteria that would potentially cause a problem? Because when you chat about zoonosis and bacteria that we can swap between one another, how often do we think that we got something from a dog? The most common thing is I caught that from who, what person when you get sick, so you're not thinking about, I caught that at the rehab clinic or, from a dog, or it's usually person to person that we're thinking about.
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right in that it doesn't happen that often, because unless we were to maybe have, a cut or something, reminds me when I had an injury to my knee years ago and cut my knee open chainsawing something and had it stitched up, went back to work that following week. And I acquired MRSA, probably just from being in contact with, I was working, this was at a rehab hospital on the human side. And, who knows where I got it, possibly anywhere really, but that we, have to have some kind of entry port. And you're right about bacteria, that most bacteria, almost all bacteria are good. And almost all viruses are bad, at least the ones we know a lot about. There are so many viruses we don't know anything about yet. Virology is its whole, is a whole world that has expanded a bit since COVID, but virology is still, there's viruses everywhere around us, all over. And the same thing with bacteria. So there's so many species, and I think in a way that though the field has been around for a long time, we still continue to learn, and the equipment is not as sophisticated as we would like. I looked at, a new cell counter last week, but it really can't get down to the size of the bacteria that I want to automatically count them for me, because it uses pixels around individual bacteria. And for $50,000, I wanted to be able to do that. So anyway, back to your question, getting off topic here. Your question was about
So how often should we be, and should we be swabbing our clinics?
Well,
And
there's
if
no
so, how
regulation
often?
that says we have to. Really on the outpatient side, inpatient side, and I think we tend to look at things when we have a bit of an outbreak.
Mhm.
Maybe we have a number of patients in a row, or at the same time, that have something. So we're not regulated, at least in America, on what we do, and most places won't have the media. They don't have a microbiology lab. They'd have to swab and send stuff out. So I think down the road, maybe the future is aptamers or some of these other ways of quick assessment for bacteria and viruses. And that's technology that's kind of emerging, where you could take these, media out into a field. Maybe you're growing lettuce and you want to see if it's been contaminated with E. coli, and you rub it on some leaves and you get immediate detection of a bacteria. Now that's a bit futuristic right now, but it's on the way. I mean, I saw an article recently that was very interesting on Band-Aids that had basically an aptamer type compound in them. And as the wound leaked into the Band-Aid, it could help identify the type of bacteria.
Wow.
Now it's a bit futuristic. It was in the future of everything in the Wall Street Journal. But that is something that we have, kind of played with. We actually have a NSF grant that's looking at aptamers right now with chemical engineering. So, more rapid detection of bacteria. I mean, that's the problem is, we still have to incubate things. We still have to grow them up, and to really look at viable bacteria, and then know how many CFUs or how many colonies. If you've got 2 or 3 colonies of something, it's probably not a big deal unless it's some very virulent, species. But most things, that's probably not a big deal. So the answer is really, we don't know. We don't know how often we should be doing it. We don't know on the human side. And we don't know on the veterinary side either how often the environment of anything should be swabbed or analyzed. And, part of the reason is if you're in an environment that maybe does have a high density of bacteria or viruses, and then you acquire something down the road, a few days later, you don't know where you got it. So it's really hard, and these CSI things. I don't know if you watch CSI in South Africa. I know it's in America, and I don't watch it here either, but I've seen enough that, they get these DNA analysis, or they take a sample and they stick it in a machine and it tells them all this stuff instantly. And those things drive me crazy because there's a lot of work that goes into identifying.
They don't exist, those machines.
No, those machines don't exist. I mean, there are, or they've skipped, a couple of days of steps of growing, So yeah, we don't have, you don't swab something, stick it in a machine, and it tells you what the bacteria is. And, and then when we have to look at resistance and do cell diffusion, and, you're looking at what it's, this bacteria is resistant to or sensitive to, that takes days too. So it's, not the easiest. And then we have a lot of contaminants, that are, even with a blood draw, we get a lot of coagulase negative staph contamination in people. So I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So we don't know how often we should be swabbing our clinics. Let's now move on to the hydrotherapy side of things. So pools and underwater treadmills. Because I think that this is an area where people are sort of more thinking about bacteria, worried about things that are growing inside their tanks possibly. And, obviously we have all things like chlorine and bromine and people use UV lights and copper and all different ways in which to try and keep that water as clean as possible. So what about the water? I mean, did you guys take some samples of the water?
Yeah. So we take samples from the water, we put it in sterile bags, then we, plate it and do all of those kind of good normal things. Water is probably, if you use, a chlorine type compound and you've got, and you're monitoring your chemicals, water is probably one of the safer things, to be honest. And if you think about, if you can smell it, the old adage was that if you can kind of smell, when you go to a water fountain, if you can kind of smell that smell that we associate with chlorine, it's probably killed any bacteria in there, anything. It's probably totally safe to drink. Now, we still do find contamination in the water. Probably the most common typically is enterics, because dogs don't maybe wipe as well as they should. And when we sample right after they're in there, there's going to be some enteric bacteria, which generally don't cause much of a problem. They die very quickly too. But, if you sample right after a dog is in there, we also sample, under the belt, same thing. Enterics are probably one of the biggest things. Staph dies pretty quickly in that environment, any type of staph. The jets, actually, in terms of the water, getting a swab in and swabbing around the jets was the most contaminated area. And again, enterics were the big one. There was some staph pseudointermedius, a little bit of Pseudomonas aeruginosa we found in the jets, also Clostridium difficile, which big problem for people, but not so big for dogs. So so yes, we found bacteria on the underwater treadmill belts and jets and in the water, and even MRSA under the belt. We have found MRSA under belts. I think about 7% of our belt samples had MRSA. So, there are areas probably of stasis in water, and the temperature is a nice, it's getting close to incubation temperature in an underwater treadmill. So it's a good temperature to grow things. But I think, the water circulating, frequently. Now, some of these units that we've tested had UV filters and they still grew as much as others, which I thought was interesting. So, I mean, with the UV filters, I think it depends on how much volume goes through it and how long it's exposed to the UV. And, UV and the UV lights, I mean, if you've used them, you may see them in airports for your cell phones and things like that. They're usually exposed for 30 to 45 seconds. And, the water's kind of running right through it. So it's probably not going to have as good of a kill rate. We don't have a lot of research on it, but so yes, we do have contamination in the water. And I would think, that, if you've got a dog that is immunocompromised or one with any kind of wounds, and, I sprayed down a dog yesterday with Cavalon that went in the treadmill. It was a femoral fracture on one side and a femoral fracture on the other side, but had a FHO. And we just kind of sprayed it down a little bit before we put him in. He's 2 weeks out, but just to be a little careful.
So what did you spray it with?
Cavalon, it's just a suture barrier.
Okay.
But he had his sutures removed yesterday. So, nothing was open, but, that was the day of suture removal. So we just wanted to be careful. It's just those sprays that go over that kind of provide a bit more of a skin barrier when they're in the treadmill. Cavalon is one we use, but I'm sure there's a million products that are out there. So I think water is probably, I guess as safe as anything and cleaner than our air. I mean, HVAC systems are traditionally very filthy. When we looked at the HVAC systems in the veterinary clinics, C. diff was, in over 80% of HVAC systems. Enterics were found in 100% of HVAC systems. Enteric species, Staph aureus, in over 80%. Pseudointermedius in about 20%. MRSA in about a third. So yeah, these guys are everywhere. We can't.
Is the HVAC? Sorry, is the HVAC like extraction?
The heating and our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. So where we normally sample on those is where the air is blowing into the room.
Okay.
And I know that may be a little different in some different parts of the world. We typically have a lot of systems here where there are vents on the ceiling that blow either the cool air or hot air in, depending on the season. And then there's an intake somewhere on the ground where the air is sucked in and, it revolves. Unlike, we have our positive and negative pressure rooms, which those are very rare, but positive pressure rooms protect the patient and the negative protect everybody else, where we modify that exchange. So yeah, the HVAC systems, filtration in those, we don't know how important it is. I mean, we're looking at some dry ozone machines or some dry hydrogen peroxide, devices to maybe keep the air a bit cleaner. But, everything from lasers we find bacteria on to life jackets, life jackets get wet and then hung up, land treadmills, everywhere, all of our exercise equipment. I mean, we find, you name it, staff, just regular staph aureus. We find on just about everywhere, staph pseudointermedius on a lot of our exercise equipment. So I think just cleaning everything on a regular basis is important. We try to clean everything at lunch and then at the end of the day. Floors, if they get wet, they certainly, if you have a yoga mat type floors, they grow mold under them very easily. So, I think we just have to be as diligent as we can with cleaning and, maybe try to at least clean twice a day. The environments are going to be, contaminated, but we want to keep it, as good as we can to protect our patients. So even scales, the scales that dogs walk on when they come in the clinic. We found, when we did, I think we did about 10 scales once at veterinary clinics. 50% had MRSA on the scales.
Wow.
Whoever cleans those scales, we don't really think about cleaning those very often. So floors, of course, are always going to be naturally dirty. That's just the way it is. I mean, we mop them a lot, but, what are you mopping your floors with? Are you using a quaternary amine? Are you leaving the water? Are you changing that water frequently? We've all seen people probably walking around the clinic with a bucket full of dirty water and they're just spreading stuff here and there. And our disinfectants, following the times on there, just spraying a table with a disinfectant and then wiping it right down may not be that effective. The kill times for different things vary from anywhere from 30 seconds to up to 5 minutes based on the product you're using. We have our bleach products and our quaternary amines and our hydrogen peroxides and, reading the instructions on the wet time for those is important.
Those are great tips. And I mean, just listening to where you found some of the bacteria in the underwater treadmill makes me think to try and clean better in those areas, like under the belts, around the jets.
Yeah, we don't actually
wiping and you just bypass a little bit and you just clean the most obvious places, right? And those
we're getting a
places
brush in there and kind of digging out around the jets and under, loosening any, bacteria from kind of where they're hiding a little bit, and then, getting them sucked back into the filters and exposed to the chlorine. Yeah, just kind of not ignoring those areas and, kind of cleaning them out routinely. Yeah, I mean, it's not that we didn't expect this. I mean, I think we, found higher levels than we would expect in clinics that look very clean, but that's the same thing on the human side.
Yeah.
There's people coming and going all the time. Our shoes are a major factor. I remember in the old days, shoe covers were super popular. I mean, especially in the UK and vet schools, everybody had shoe covers. Shoe covers have kind of gone away, but maybe they did help a bit. I don't know.
So if a vet rehabber is concerned about their clinic, let's say they've had a few cases and there've been some, post-operative infections and they're thinking, wow, like this is just a little bit too coincidental that we've had so many. What would be the steps that they would take? So like, how would they get the swabs? Who do they contact? What's the best procedure for them to take if they're thinking that there is some problem at their clinic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess unless you have an in-house lab, which a few clinics do, but not many. I mean, you take cultures and then you send them off and then they tell you what you've got. And then if it's the same, kind of species, then, we recently here have had some, an influenza virus in the US. I think the H3N8 that's affected a lot of veterinary clinics. So, we, for example, for about the past 3 weeks, we haven't allowed staff to bring their dogs to work. just to help, prevent spread and let everything get clean. But most clinics, just about every clinic will work with some lab. Now, if it's just a rehab only clinic, they may not. So they may, have to think about what local labs can do some swabbing, or maybe you can, bring the swabs too. I mean, the bacteria or viruses, things like that die very quickly, once they're put in isolation. So you have to get them, on some growth media pretty rapidly. If you swab your clinic and then you take those swabs and just stick them in the mail and send them somewhere, they're all going to be dead by the time they get there. They have to be on ice or swabbed, plated within a few hours. I mean, they die very rapidly. We look at, if we put staph, for example, on metal, just some Staph aureus, and we leave it there for an hour, probably 90% are dead when we come back in an hour. So we do look at, how long different bacteria live on different media. That's another thing we kind of do, different plastics or metals, and or within, for example, things like a lotion. I mean, they're looking for some organic matter to eat to stay alive. And, also exposure to certain temperature and light can kill a lot of them, but, they're becoming more hardy as they, kind of evolve and mutate. And that's, never a good thing. Antibiotic resistance, of course, is, part of that. And we, when we test our water, for example, in our water sources, so we get our water from a couple of aquifers and the Tennessee River. And the water has multiple steps of filtration before it gets to your house. But if you test that water, I'll give you a quiz. What do you think are the two medications? This is our human drinking water we find most commonly in our drinking water. If we were to test
medication.
Yeah, because people, take medications, they excrete it. So there's two types that we are kind of at the top of the list.
Ibuprofen?
No, prescription medications.
Probably like antidepressants or something like
that. Oh yeah, benzodiazepines are number one.
Yeah.
Yes. So because so many people take benzos.
Present in the water?
And yes, wow. It's present in the drinking. And so in our water sources, as they come into our water filtration plants, benzos and antibiotics are found in measurable amounts as they come in. And then, of course, you try to filter those things out. So all of these, and then the antibiotics too, we have them in a lot of animal food. Animals also excrete, they get into our drinking sources, and, a lot of, antibiotic. Well, I mean, 70% of the antibiotics in the US are used for animals and primarily food production, in animal food to keep animals healthy, to get them to market. Only about 30% of the antibiotics are used for human health. And then that may be varied, based on different countries' regulations. And, we do things differently. When I was in Japan and I saw people eating raw chicken at the table with me, I was a bit, then we had a discussion on how they vaccinate the chickens for salmonella. And, so it's very interesting. And now I still am not a fan of eating raw chicken because of the texture, but, and you certainly don't see that in the US, but we also don't, vaccinate poultry for that. So yeah, I mean, these things get into our water sources. I mean, they're all around us, and by default we eat animal products that have been fed a lot of antibiotics, and that may contribute to our resistance as well. So we have a lot of evolving kind of issues in this area. Water is pretty fascinating, how we take for granted also our drinking water. In a lot of countries where you can turn on the tap and drink. And that's not the case in so much of the world. I've been to many countries where you don't touch anything but bottled water. And in many of these countries too, there is no recycling. So, these bottles just create floating islands. And, so these are larger problems than we're going to solve today. But, I think just, being diligent on cleaning every exercise piece of equipment, cleaning your floors, cleaning things like a life jacket a dog wears or a harness, the scales, like we mentioned, just, really cleaning everything a couple of times a day in accordance with the cleaning product that you're using's recommended times. It's kind of like when hand sanitizer came out, you'd see people put a drop on and do this and be done. Well, hand sanitizer, you're supposed to use enough that it takes 20 seconds for it all to evaporate and go up past your wrists. So, if you're using it in the right way, at 20 seconds, it should finally all evaporate to kill everything on your hands. Not this little drop. And sometimes, like at the airport, you stick your hand under it and it gives you like a little tiny drop.
Yeah.
You're like, I need to stick my hand under there 10 times to get enough to actually clean it. So, it's a fascinating area to me. I got to be involved in a really cool study. We opened a new children's hospital, an outpatient building, 4 stories, enormous building. And we cultured the building for 6 months before the building opened, and then 6 months after it opened to see how bacteria colonize and how they change over the first 6 months of a hospital opening.
Wow.
So it was really interesting. A lot of, to see the bacterial species that weren't there begin to emerge in the environment, and what types in different units, because they had pulmonary units, general medicine, orthopedics, cardiology, and different bacteria.
Sure. That must have been really interesting. Now, MRSA is something that obviously is a little bit scary, because it's one of those things where we think, well, potentially we might not be able to treat. And if we have, let's say, a client who says to us, so they've been diagnosed with an infection and they've got MRSA, and let's say we swab our clinic and we have MRSA there. I mean, how serious is it? Is it something now that, is a lot more seen, because you've mentioned a few times you've seen MRSA in a lot of the clinics. In my mind, it was something like when you got that, you literally close your clinic down. What would the procedure that a vet rehabber should do if they did swab and MRSA was in their clinic? Is it something serious that they'd have to close the clinic, or would it just be a deep clean that they'd need to do?
So I would think if we had to close the clinics, we'd all be closed, because I guarantee I could probably find MRSA in everyone's clinic. So, MRSA it's just a type of staph infection that's more difficult to treat because of its resistance to some antibiotics, but we still have, a number that it is resistant to. And also a lot of our cleaners, our bleach compounds, our quaternariamines, they kill MRSA pretty well. The biggest thing to think about is, is skin to skin contact. Really, that's our big way of acquiring it. And, we have to have some portal generally. I mean, you can, you might not know you have some little disruption in the skin that could potentially cause it. But, we know that when we swab, for example, nurses in the US, maybe 4 to 5% are MRSA carriers if we just do nasal swabs. So a lot of us are carriers. I've had it. So I'm, am I a carrier for life? Some people, when they're tested, they're not. And some people, it does kind of keep coming back. But it's a bit more difficult to kill and manage, but it's certainly not a clinic, closer. Again, our normal products will take care of it. It's just avoiding that skin to skin contact, isolating that patient.
Yeah.
And going from there. So,
David, thank you so much. It's been really interesting chatting to you, and I can see how passionate you are. And I must say, this is something that I never knew about you, and I've known you for quite a while. So this whole side, and I love the idea about taking the pictures. There's lots of artists that are out there that do like one thing. There's like a lady who does these little miniature drawings. So I can see you maybe David Levine in a few years when you're retired and you've got all your images that you're taking from checking under the microscope. So looking forward to seeing all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would, if you have a kid interested in science, get them a microscope and just teach them how to like pick things up and look at things. You'll make a kid, so fascinated. So now none of my kids liked it. I've always had a microscope at home and they were like, that's a nerdy thing, Dad. But some people some people, maybe it'll create that bug and we'll have the next, Jonas Salk produced from this podcast.
Awesome, David. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And I think the
you.
biggest thing that I've learned is just to clean more. So, I mean, I think generally we do like once a day big cleans, but I think clean more, guys. Clean more throughout the day. Just keep
and
cleaning.
Watching the cleaning times on the product. Some, like hydrogen peroxide doesn't clean as quickly as bleach or the quartz or some of those other things. Read the times on them,
Yeah.
the wet times. I think that's the other thing. And look for areas that you don't normally clean. If you've got yoga mats, yeah, we might clean around them, but do we lift them up and get under them?
Yeah.
Or
Clean everything.
Yeah. I mean, just, we're coming into flu season, get your flu shots and keep everybody healthy. So
Thanks so much, David. It's been great
all
chatting
right.
to you. Have an
Take care,
awesome day.
Megan.
Cheers. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. I'm here every week talking to vet rehab therapists from all over the world about all things vet rehab. For more information about continuing education for vet rehab therapists, you can go to Onlinepethealth.com. I'd like to thank you for listening to this podcast and, of course, thank our sponsors, Response System. They are as passionate about therapy lasers and PEMF equipment as you are about veterinary rehabilitation. They would love to answer any questions you have, so please feel free to reach out to them at responsesystems.com, or you can email lisa@responsesystems.com.